In the scorching deserts of ancient Arabia, where reality bleeds into myth, there existed beings so powerful that even the wisest king who ever lived could barely contain them. These were not the wish-granting cartoon genies of Western fantasy, but the Marid, the most terrifying and magnificent class of jinn ever described in Islamic tradition. Born from smokeless fire before humanity even existed, they possessed knowledge that could shatter minds and power that could reshape the very fabric of reality itself. When King Solomon, the prophet who commanded armies of spirits and spoke the language of every living creature, sought to bind these ancient entities, he discovered something that would haunt him until his final breath. The Marid were not just powerful beyond measure, they were intelligent, cunning, and utterly unpredictable in ways that made them more dangerous than any demon or fallen angel. What Solomon learned in those encounters would be carefully preserved in forbidden texts and whispered warnings passed down through countless generations. This is the true story of the Marid, and why even mentioning their name was once considered an invitation to catastrophe. If you're ready to look beyond the veil of forgotten myths and uncover the secrets the world chose to forget, subscribe to Inside Strange Times, so you won't miss new journeys into the realm of ancient mysteries. To understand the Marid, you must first understand that everything the Western world thinks it knows about genies is a childish distortion of something far more ancient and infinitely more terrifying. The word jinn itself comes from the Arabic root meaning to hide or to conceal, and these beings have been hiding in plain sight within human consciousness since long before the Prophet Muhammad received his revelations in the 7th century. But the Marid represents something different entirely. They are not simply spirits or demons, but entities that existed in a state between matter and energy long before Allah shaped Adam from clay. The ancient Arabs who wandered the endless deserts of the Arabian Peninsula understood something that modern rationalism has tried desperately to forget. They knew that the world contained layers of reality that human eyes could never perceive, and that certain beings moved through these layers with the ease of sharks gliding through dark water. The Marid were the apex predators of this invisible world, beings created from smokeless fire, who possessed intellect that rivaled or exceeded human genius and powers that made them nearly indistinguishable from gods. Islamic tradition describes several distinct classes of jinn, and the hierarchy among them is as rigid and complex as any human social structure. At the bottom dwell the weakest jinn, who can barely manifest physically and possess limited powers of deception and minor magic. Above them rise the Ifrit, powerful and cunning beings associated with fire and destruction, who serve as soldiers and warriors in the jinn kingdoms. Then come the Shaitan, the rebellious ones who rejected divine authority and now work to corrupt and mislead humanity at every turn. But towering above them all in raw power and ancient wisdom stand the Marid, and even other jinns speak their name, with something approaching reverence or fear. The Marid differ from their lesser cousins in ways that go far beyond simple measurements of magical strength. Where an Ifrit might command flames, and an ordinary jinn might create illusions, the Marid possess abilities that blur the line between magic and divine miracle. They can manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself, bending space to cross impossible distances in a single step, stopping time within limited spheres of influence, and even peering into possible futures to see the consequences of actions not yet taken. Ancient texts describe Marid who could raise islands from the ocean floor or sink entire cities beneath the waves, who could transform lead into gold, not through alchemy but through direct molecular manipulation, and who possessed knowledge of sciences and arts that would not be rediscovered by humans for thousands of years. But perhaps their most dangerous quality was not their power but their nature. Unlike the Ifrit, who burn with predictable rage, or the Shaitan, who follow clear patterns of corruption, the Merid were utterly unpredictable in their motivations and desires. Some ancient accounts describe them as beings of pure whimsy, who might grant incredible boons to a peasant who amused them while destroying a king who bored them. But other texts paint them as creatures of such alien intelligence that human beings could no more understand their goals than an ant could comprehend chess. The physical descriptions of Merid that survive in pre-Islamic Arabian folklore and later Islamic texts reveal beings that defied comfortable categorization. Some witnesses claimed they appeared as impossibly beautiful humans with skin that seemed to contain the light of distant stars and eyes that held the depth of endless oceans. Others described towering forms that shifted and changed moment to moment, sometimes humanoid, but just as often appearing as columns of colored smoke or geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly. One particularly detailed account from a 9th century manuscript describes a Merid encountered by a merchant caravan in the Rub al-Khali desert as a being whose true form could not be perceived, only the space around it that bent and warped as if reality itself was trying to accommodate something too vast to properly fit into three-dimensional space. The most consistent detail across all descriptions was their association with water. While lesser jinn might inhabit flames or dust storms, the Merid were said to dwell in the deepest parts of oceans and seas, in underground rivers that had never seen sunlight, and in impossible spaces where water existed in forms that defied natural law. Some scholars believe this connection to water relates to their nature as the most fluid and adaptable of all jinn, beings who could flow around obstacles and fill any container while always maintaining their essential nature. Long before Solomon raised his temple in Jerusalem, the people of Arabia had learned to fear and respect the Merid through bitter experience. Stories passed down through generations told of entire tribes that vanished overnight after their chieftain offended a Merid, of oases that dried up because a Merid took offense at pollution or disrespect, and of rare individuals who gained the favor of these beings and received gifts that elevated them to legendary status. One such story tells of a poet named Shanfara who lived in pre-Islamic Arabia and supposedly received from a Merid the ability to compose verses of such beauty and power that they could move stones to tears and cause plants to bloom in the desert. But these early encounters were nothing compared to what would happen when the greatest king in history decided to systematically catalog and control every jinn in existence. Solomon, son of David, was not merely a wise ruler or a wealthy monarch. According to Islamic tradition, he was a prophet granted by Allah abilities that no human before or since has possessed. He could speak with animals and command them as generals command armies. He could understand the language of birds and insects, and most significantly, he possessed the power to compel jinn to serve him whether they wished to or not. The source of Solomon's power over the jinn came from a ring given to him directly by Allah, a band of brass and iron inscribed with the greatest name of God. With this ring, Solomon could summon any jinn or demon and bind them with unbreakable commands, forcing even the mightiest entities to labor on his behalf. The temple he built in Jerusalem was constructed not just by human hands, but by armies of jinn who worked day and night under Solomon's absolute authority, shaping stones that no human tools could cut and raising walls that defied normal architectural principles. But when Solomon turned his attention to the Merid, he discovered that controlling these ancient beings required more than simple commands and mystical authority. The Merid were too intelligent to be fooled by loopholes in instructions, and too powerful to be held by normal binding spells that worked perfectly well on lesser Djinn. They would follow the letter of Solomon's commands while subverting the spirit, creating results that were technically correct but practically disastrous. One famous story tells of Solomon ordering a Merid to build him a palace more beautiful than any structure on earth, and the Merid complied by creating a building so impossibly magnificent that any human who looked upon it went blind from the sheer, overwhelming perfection of its form. The relationship between Solomon and the Merid evolved into a complex dance of mutual respect and constant tension. Solomon learned that these beings responded not to threats or displays of power, but to challenges and riddles, to demonstrations of wisdom rather than force. He would spend hours in consultation with captured Merid, asking them questions about the nature of reality and receiving answers that expanded his understanding of creation itself. The Merid in turn seemed to appreciate Solomon's intellect and began teaching him secrets of magic and science that went far beyond what any human had previously known. Yet this cooperation always balanced on a knife's edge of danger. The Merid never forgot that they were bound against their will, and they constantly tested the limits of Solomon's control. Islamic texts describe multiple occasions when Merid nearly escaped their bindings through clever interpretation of commands or by exploiting tiny flaws in the magical circles that contained them. On one particularly dangerous occasion, a Merid named Sakhr managed to steal Solomon's ring while the king bathed and used it to impersonate him for 40 days, ruling the kingdom and spreading chaos until Solomon finally recovered his seal and restored order. This incident with Sakhr reveals something crucial about the Merid that sets them apart from other Djinn. They were not merely powerful, they were patient and capable of planning over timescales that humans could barely comprehend. A Merid might serve obediently for decades while quietly working on an escape plan that required precisely the right circumstances to execute. They could hold grudges for centuries and wait for the perfect moment to exact revenge on those who had wronged them. The question that haunted scholars for centuries after Solomon's time was why the Merid agreed to serve at all. Solomon's ring gave him authority, but these beings possessed enough power to potentially resist even divine command if they truly chose to rebel. Some texts suggest that the Merid saw their servitude as a form of cosmic game, a test of their ingenuity and patience against Solomon's wisdom. Others propose that they recognized in Solomon something rare, a human whose intellect approached their own and who might teach them things they could not learn in isolation. What Solomon learned from the Merid changed the course of human history in ways that most people never realize. The advanced mathematics and engineering principles that allowed him to build his legendary temple, the medical knowledge that could cure previously incurable diseases, the understanding of astronomy and navigation that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years. All of these came, at least partially, from information provided by captured Merid. But Solomon was wise enough to understand that such knowledge came with hidden dangers. The Merid never gave information freely or innocently. Every piece of knowledge they shared was a potential trap that could destroy civilizations if misused or misunderstood. After Solomon's death, the Merid he had bound were eventually freed. some through the breaking of binding spells and others through the simple passage of time as magical containments weakened. What these ancient beings did with their freedom became the subject of countless stories and legends throughout the Islamic world. Some texts claim they retreated to the deepest parts of the ocean to sulk and plot revenge against humanity. Others suggest they returned to whatever mysterious dimension they originally came from, content to observe human affairs from a safe distance. But darker accounts whisper that many married remained in the world and began systematically destroying every trace of the knowledge they had given Solomon, ensuring that humans would never again possess the tools needed to bind them. The encounter between one particular Marid and a foolish sorcerer in 9th century Baghdad illustrates perfectly why these beings remained objects of terror long after Solomon's time. A magician named Al-Jassas believed he had discovered a new binding spell that could control even the mightiest Djinn without need for Solomon's ring. He spent years preparing his ritual, inscribing protective circles and gathering rare ingredients until he felt confident enough to attempt summoning a Marid. The being that appeared in response to his call seemed almost amused by the attempt, answering the sorcerer's questions and performing minor tasks as requested. Al-Jassas grew confident that his spell had worked and began making increasingly bold demands. Then one night, the Marid simply stopped pretending to be bound. It revealed that it had been free the entire time and had only played along because it found the sorcerer's arrogance entertaining. Now that the entertainment had grown stale, it had other plans. The accounts of what happened next vary in details, but all agree on the outcome. Al-Jassas was found 3 days later transformed into living glass, still conscious and aware but unable to move or speak, condemned to spend eternity as a transparent statue watching the world go by. The Marid left him displayed in the center of Baghdad's main square as a warning to other would-be binders, and according to some versions of the story, the glass sorcerer remained there for over 100 years before finally shattering during an earthquake. Stories like this ensured that by the medieval period, most Islamic scholars and magicians had concluded that attempting to bind or control Marid was suicidal folly. Even summoning them for simple conversation was considered incredibly dangerous because these beings could read intentions and see through deceptions with ease. A human might think they were being clever or respectful, but a Marid would perceive every hidden motive and unspoken desire, and might take offense at thoughts the summoner didn't even realize they were having. Yet, despite all warnings, there remained individuals in every generation who believed they could succeed where others had failed. Some were driven by desperate need, seeking Marid assistance to cure incurable diseases or prevent catastrophes. Others were motivated by pure ambition, convinced that controlling such power would elevate them above all rivals. And a few were scholars genuinely curious about the nature of these beings and willing to risk everything for knowledge. The results of these attempts created a catalog of cautionary tales that spans centuries and cultures. A Persian merchant who summoned a Marid to make him wealthy found his wish granted when the being transformed him into a living gold statue, technically fulfilling the request while making the wealth completely useless. A Moorish princess who asked a Marid to make her the most beautiful woman in the world received her wish. But the Marid's version of ultimate beauty was so alien and wrong that everyone who looked upon her went mad. An Egyptian scholar who politely requested information about the future received it, but the knowledge of his own death and the deaths of everyone he loved drove him to suicide within a week. The pattern across all these stories reveals something important about how Merid think and operate. They do not necessarily lie, but they interpret requests in ways that humans would never anticipate. Their sense of humor is cruel by human standards, and their idea of an appropriate response to disrespect is completely disproportionate to anything in human social norms. Most tellingly, they seem to view humans the way humans might view particularly clever pets, sometimes amusing and occasionally worth helping, but ultimately beneath serious consideration as equals. This attitude explains why the rare positive encounters between humans and Merid almost always involved individuals who approached these beings with genuine humility and respect, rather than demands or attempts at control. A famous story from 12th century Andalusia tells of a Sufi mystic who spent his life in prayer and meditation by the shore of the Mediterranean. One day, a Merid emerged from the waves and simply sat beside him, not speaking but apparently content to share the mystic's peaceful presence. This continued for years, with the Merid appearing regularly but never interacting beyond silent companionship. When the mystic finally died of old age, the Merid was present, and witnesses claimed it placed a single pearl on the holy man's chest before disappearing forever into the depths. That pearl reportedly contained such perfect light that it was later set in the crown of a caliph and became legendary for bringing wisdom and clarity to whoever wore it. But for every story of peaceful coexistence, there were dozens of tales of destruction and horror. The Merid were not evil in any simple sense. They were something far more dangerous. They were immensely powerful beings with their own incomprehensible goals and a complete lack of concern for human welfare. They might destroy a city as casually as a human might brush away an insect, not out of malice but simple indifference. Or they might nurture and protect a particular human for reasons that made sense only to themselves. Their unpredictability made them impossible to prepare for, and their power made them impossible to fight. The stories of the Merid force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of reality and humanity's place within it. In the modern Western world, we have grown accustomed to a particular narrative about human progress. The idea that we move steadily forward from superstition toward enlightenment, and that ancient beliefs about supernatural beings were simply primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena we now understand through science. But the Islamic tradition regarding Merid presents something that resists this comfortable dismissal. These were not explanations for thunder or disease. They were detailed accounts of encounters with intelligent entities that possessed knowledge and abilities far exceeding human capabilities. What makes the Merid particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is how consistent the descriptions remain across centuries and vastly different geographic regions. A 10th century account from Persia describes Merid behavior and characteristics that closely match descriptions from 14th century Morocco and 16th century Indonesia. This consistency suggests either a shared cultural transmission that was remarkably stable over time and distance, or that people across the Islamic world were encountering and interpreting something real through their cultural and religious framework. Neither possibility is comfortable for modern rationalism. The first implies a level of cultural cohesion that seems implausible, and the second requires accepting that perhaps these encounters had some basis in objective reality. The transformation of Djinn into the Western concept of genies represents one of the most dramatic distortions in cross-cultural transmission. When European scholars and travelers first encountered Islamic stories about Djinn, They filtered them through their own cultural expectations and literary traditions. The result was the genie of Western fairy tales, a magical servant trapped in a lamp who grants 3 wishes and speaks in rhyming couplets. This sanitized, domesticated version bears almost no resemblance to the terrifying reality of Marid as understood in their original context. The most famous example of this distortion is the story of Aladdin, which most Westerners know through animated films and pantomime shows. The original tale from 1001 Nights describes something far darker and more complex than the family-friendly versions suggest. The Djinn in that story is not a lovable sidekick, but a being of terrible power who serves Aladdin only because it is magically compelled to do so. The text makes clear that this Djinn would destroy Aladdin instantly if the binding ever failed, and that every wish granted comes with risks and complications that the young protagonist barely understands. Even more significantly, the original story emphasizes that Aladdin's control over the Djinn is temporary and precarious, a gift of fortune that could be lost at any moment. This distortion matters because it reveals how uncomfortable Western culture has been with the idea of powerful, non-human intelligence that humans cannot ultimately control or understand. The Western genie must be containable, must be ultimately less powerful than the human who commands it, must be friendly or at least neutral in its intentions. The Murid of Islamic tradition allows for none of these comforting assumptions. They are older than humanity, more intelligent than the wisest human, and completely indifferent to human welfare except when it serves their own incomprehensible purposes. The theological implications of the Murid within Islamic thought are profound and complex. Unlike angels, who have no free will and exist only to serve divine purposes, Jinn, including Murid, possess the same free will that humans have. They can choose to obey or rebel, to do good or evil, to submit to Allah or reject divine guidance. This makes them in some ways closer to humans than angels are, fellow travelers on a cosmic journey toward judgment. But their vastly greater power and longevity mean that their choices carry consequences on scales humans can barely imagine. Some Islamic scholars have argued that the Murid represent a test for humanity, beings deliberately created with overwhelming power to see how humans would respond when faced with forces beyond their control. Would humans attempt to dominate and exploit such beings as so many sorcerers tried to do, or would they recognize the wisdom in respectful distance and humble acceptance of their own limitations? From this perspective, the stories of failed binding attempts are not just cautionary tales, but theological lessons about the proper relationship between humans and the supernatural world. The influence of Murid stories on Islamic literature, philosophy, and culture cannot be overstated. They appear constantly in classical Arabic poetry, sometimes as metaphors for political power or natural forces, but often as themselves, ancient beings whose actions shape human destiny. Sufi mystics wrote extensively about jinn, using them as symbols for the hidden aspects of reality that can only be perceived through spiritual insight rather than material observation. Legal scholars debated the proper Islamic response to jinn encounters, whether binding them was permissible, what obligations humans had toward these non-human persons, and how to address the question of jinn who claim to have converted to Islam. Yes, that last point is not a joke. Islamic tradition holds that jinn can convert to Islam, and numerous historical accounts exist of humans claiming to have met Muslim jinn who observed prayers and fasted during Ramadan. The Quran itself states that some jinn heard Muhammad's recitation and believed, which established them as potential members of the Islamic community. This creates fascinating theological and legal questions. If a married converts to Islam, does it have the same rights and protections as a human Muslim? Can jinn and humans testify against each other in Islamic courts? What happens if a human marries a jinn, which some texts suggest is possible, though strongly discouraged? These questions might seem absurd from a modern secular perspective, but they reveal something important about the Islamic worldview. In this framework, reality is not divided into natural and supernatural, but rather into visible and invisible aspects of a single unified creation. Jinn are not paranormal or miraculous. They are simply part of the normal fabric of reality that happens to be invisible to human eyes under most circumstances. This means that Islamic civilization had to develop practical frameworks for dealing with these beings, just as it developed frameworks for dealing with any other aspect of reality. The legacy of Solomon's encounters with the Marid extends far beyond Islamic tradition. Jewish texts also preserve stories of Solomon's power over demons and spirits, though the details differ significantly from Islamic accounts. Christian medieval grimoires claim to preserve Solomon's magical techniques, promising readers the ability to summon and control spirits just as the wise king once did. These grimoires, with their elaborate circles and incomprehensible symbols, represent perhaps the most dangerous misunderstanding of the original stories. They present binding spirits as a mechanical process. Follow these steps, and you will achieve these results. When the original Islamic texts make clear that Solomon's success came from divine authority, combined with personal wisdom that could not be replicated through mere technical procedures. The historical impact of these grimoires was nevertheless significant. Medieval and Renaissance Europe became obsessed with ceremonial magic, the idea that through proper ritual and preparation, humans could command supernatural beings. Countless individuals attempted these rituals, some probably achieving nothing but psychological experiences, others perhaps making contact with forces they completely misunderstood. The records of the Inquisition contain numerous cases of people accused of trafficking with demons using techniques supposedly derived from Solomon. And while many of these accusations were certainly false, some of the confessions describe experiences eerily similar to Islamic accounts of failed Marid binding attempts. Modern attempts to rationalize or explain away the Marid tend to fall into several predictable categories. Psychologists suggest they represent projections of the unconscious mind, humanity's fears and desires given external form. Anthropologists argue they served social functions, teaching respect for natural forces and discouraging hubris. Skeptics simply dismiss them as superstitious nonsense that educated people should ignore. But none of these explanations adequately account for the specificity and consistency of the historical accounts. Consider the level of detail in classical Islamic texts about jinn behavior and characteristics. These are not vague monster stories, but systematic descriptions that read more like field observations of an actual species. They describe how different classes of jinn reproduce, what they eat, if anything, how they organize their societies, what languages they speak, how they perceive time differently than humans, what environments they prefer, how they communicate with each other. The Marid in particular are described with the kind of specificity that suggests either elaborate shared fantasy or documentation of real encounters filtered through religious and cultural understanding. The question we must ultimately confront is not whether merit exists in some literal physical sense, but what the persistence and power of these stories tells us about human experience and the limits of our understanding. For over 1,000 years, millions of people across vast geographic and cultural spans believed absolutely in the reality of these beings. They structured their theology, philosophy, and practical magic around this belief. They developed elaborate protocols for avoiding or interacting with merit. They told and retold stories about encounters that shaped how entire civilizations understood reality. Perhaps the truth about the merit lies not in proving they exist or don't exist, but in understanding what their stories preserve. They represent humanity's oldest and most persistent intuition that we are not alone in the universe and that not everything that shares existence with us is friendly or comprehensible. They embody the terrifying possibility that intelligence and power do not necessarily align with human values or interests. They remind us that there are vast domains of reality that remain beyond human perception and control, no matter how much our technology advances. In an age where humanity has split atoms and walked on the moon, it is tempting to believe we have transcended the old superstitions about beings of fire and smoke. But the fundamental questions the married stories raise remain unanswered. What should humans do when confronted with intelligence vastly superior to our own? How should we respond to power we cannot match? What does wisdom look like in the face of forces beyond our understanding? These questions are, if anything, more relevant now than they were in Solomon's time. We simply frame them in terms of artificial intelligence and potential alien contact, rather than jinn and spirits. The merit endure in human consciousness because they represent something essential and true about our condition. We are small beings in a vast universe, clever but not wise, powerful enough to reshape our world but not wise enough to foresee all the consequences. We grasp at control and understanding, building systems and technologies that promise to make reality manageable and safe. But the old stories whisper a different truth, that some things cannot be controlled, that some beings will never be understood, and that perhaps the deepest wisdom lies not in binding the powers that terrify us, but in learning to live with appropriate humility in a universe that does not exist for our convenience. When Solomon finally died according to Islamic tradition, he died standing upright, leaning on his staff. The jinn he had bound continued their labors, believing he still lived and watched them. Only when a worm finally ate through his staff and his body fell did they realize he was gone. The symbolism is almost too perfect. Human power and control are illusions maintained only through constant vigilance. The moment that vigilance fails, reality reasserts itself, and the forces we thought we commanded reveal they were never truly bound at all. The merit are still out there, if the old stories are to be believed. Perhaps they dwell in the deepest ocean trenches, where human eyes have never penetrated. Perhaps they exist in dimensions adjacent to our own that we lack the senses to perceive. Perhaps they simply watch and wait, as they have for millennia, observing humanity's rise and wondering if we will ever produce another Solomon, or if we will destroy ourselves first. We will probably never know. But the next time you stand at the edge of the ocean and feel the terrible weight of its depths, or gaze at the night sky and contemplate the vast emptiness between stars, remember that the ancient Arabs who first told stories of the merit were not fools. They understood something profound about the nature of existence, that humanity is not the measure of all things, that intelligence and power exist in forms we cannot fully comprehend, and that sometimes the wisest course is not to seek control, but to acknowledge the vastness of what lies beyond our grasp. The Marid remain as they have always been, ancient, powerful, unknowable, waiting in the hidden places of the world for the next fool who thinks they can command the uncontrollable or the next sage wise enough to recognize them for what they truly are.